They thought parking on my property without permission was no big deal until I legally sold every one of their cars at a public auction. What would you do if your neighbors treated your land like free parking and your HOA backed them up? Welcome to the channel. If you love savage HOA revenge stories, hit subscribe and comment below where you're watching from. My name's Evan, and for the past 5 years, I've lived on a quiet 3-acre parcel at the edge of Pinebrook Hollow, a supposedly peaceful suburban community nestled just outside the city limits. Technically, my property was part of the subdivision when it was first built in the early 2000s, but due to how the developer carved up the land and where the main entrance ended, my home and acreage weren't part of the official HOA jurisdiction. It's one of those weird zoning anomalies that happened during a rushed land deal 15 years ago. And believe me, it's been a blessing until recently. My house sits at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with tall oaks and low wooden fences. The back 2 acres are a mix of lightly wooded meadow and open field, quiet, natural, and flat. I don't use it for much besides the occasional barbecue or stargazing night. I've never had kids, just a golden retriever named Buck and a few solar lights that flicker along the gravel after sunset. No garden gnomes, no inflatable Santas, no bright colors to offend picky neighbors. Just a modest 2-story home with tan siding and a metal roof tucked away in what used to be considered the buffer lot between the development and the forest preserve. And for years, that's all it was. Peaceful, untouched, undisturbed. The HOA knew I existed. They even sent me a welcome letter when I moved in, though they acknowledged in small print that my parcel wasn't bound to the HOA bylaws. Occasionally, I'd get their newsletters stuffed in my mailbox out of habit. Nothing personal. For the most part, they left me alone, and I returned the favor. I'd see a few board members at the farmer's market or wave at familiar faces during walks through the main neighborhood loop. I had no issues with anyone. That all started to change last fall. It began subtly, almost unnoticeably. One Friday afternoon, I came home from work and saw a silver Lexus parked half on the side of my gravel drive and half on the edge of my front yard. Thinking someone got lost, or maybe their GPS had glitched, I walked up to the car and found a business card on the dashboard. It belonged to Charles Greer, the HOA vice president. I remember thinking it was odd. He had no reason to be at my place, and he certainly hadn't knocked on my door. But I let it go. Maybe it was a mistake. A week later, it happened again. This time, 2 SUVs parked side by side in the field just past my mailbox. A man in a blue polo with an embroidered Pinebrook logo waved at me casually as I got out of my truck. "Overflow parking," he said with a grin, then gestured toward the main road. Board meeting. We're slammed. Before I could reply, he walked off, chatting with a woman in heels who trailed behind him with a tablet in hand. I remember standing there, stunned. There were no cones, no signs, no calls, no requests. They just decided that my field was available real estate because it was close and convenient. That rubbed me the wrong way, but I still didn't confront anyone. At the time, I figured it was a one-time thing. Maybe they thought they had permission. I didn't want to be the guy who caused drama over a couple of parked cars. But then came the harvest fair. That's when everything escalated. The HOA hosted an annual neighborhood-wide celebration in late October. Face painting, hay rides, food trucks, and local vendors. They closed off the main circle, invited a bounce house company, and even rented a sound system. I had no issue with any of that. In fact, I thought it was a nice touch for the community. But on the morning of the event, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel. I looked out the window and saw a line of vehicles driving through the gate at the bottom of my driveway. Not 1, not 3, but a solid dozen SUVs. Sedans and minivans were lined up like they were entering a concert venue. They turned off into the field I rarely used, parking row by row in the dry grass. Headlights flashing as people in pastel cardigans and HOA polos directed traffic like they were coordinating a wedding. I threw on a sweatshirt and stepped out onto my porch. "Hey!" I shouted. A woman holding a clipboard turned toward me with a smile. Oh, don't worry, sir. You're not in trouble. We're just using the lot for overflow. The main circle is full for the harvest fair. This isn't a lot, I said, pointing toward the ground. This is my land. She looked momentarily confused, then checked her clipboard and tilted her head. You're Evan, right? The one at 7,821 Ridgeview? I nodded. She smiled again. Right, you're technically non-compliant. Not part of the HOA, but part of the old developer tract. Still part of Pine Brook Hollow. That was the first time I heard someone use that phrase, technically non-compliant, as if that gave them permission to treat my property like public space. I never agreed to let people park here, I told her. Her smile tightened. Well, the board voted to use it this once. We thought you'd be fine with it. It's just for today. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that they'd overstepped, that they should have asked. But by then, 3 more cars were pulling into my drive, and she turned back to her clipboard without another word. I stood there for a few minutes, watching kids pile out of vehicles with painted faces, couples carrying pumpkin spice lattes and folding chairs, adults laughing like this was their private event space. The field behind me was now a full-blown parking lot, and my name wasn't on a single clipboard. That night, when the harvest fair wrapped up, I walked through the field and counted 39 separate tire tracks. Someone had left behind 2 empty beer bottles. Another had knocked over my small stone marker near the edge of the woods, a decorative piece I'd had for years. There was also a patch of torn-up grass near the south corner, where I assumed someone did a 3-point turn too tight. The following week, it happened again. This time, it was for a baby shower hosted by one of the board members, and again they used my land without asking. Then came the winter social, the spring HOA elections, and the neighborhood yard sale. Each time, my field became their overflow zone. They never asked, they never thanked me, and they never offered compensation. It had gone from occasional trespassing to full-on entitlement. And every time I politely asked for clarification or suggested they use another lot, I was brushed off with phrases like temporary access or you're not technically under HOA protection, so we assumed. I installed a sign, private property, no parking, but someone took it down. I put up a second one. That one disappeared too. They had gotten used to the convenience of my land, and I had allowed it to happen for too long. What started as a peaceful patch of nature had become a battleground for boundaries they no longer respected. I wasn't just part of the neighborhood anymore. I had become their unofficial parking structure, and I was done being quiet about it. It was a Saturday morning in early spring, the kind of morning that usually had me drinking coffee on the porch, with Buck lying at my feet and birds chirping somewhere in the sycamores. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with soft blues and the promise of sunshine, and for a few rare minutes, everything felt calm again. That is, until I stepped off my porch and saw the scene unfolding on my property, like some twisted parody of a public parking garage. At least 10 vehicles, SUVs, minivans, a beat-up Camry with a broken taillight, and even a white Tesla with Pine Brook Hollow decals were neatly lined up across the front half of my meadow. The grass was still damp from last night's rain, and fresh tire marks carved uneven paths through the wet earth, but that wasn't even the worst of it. What caught my eye and nearly made me drop my coffee mug was a cheap A-frame sign stuck crookedly into the gravel at the edge of my driveway, with black marker scrawled across a warped piece of cardboard. Overflow parking. Event at 108 Holloway. Thanks for understanding. And underneath that, in smaller writing, private property of Evan. Temporary use permitted. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I didn't write that. I'd never written anything like that. My heart started pounding, not from anger at first, but sheer disbelief. Someone had forged my name and stuck a sign in my yard to give other people permission to trample my land, and they did it like it was no big deal, like I was a footnote in their weekend plans. I marched straight toward the sign, pulled it from the ground, and stormed back to my truck. My phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group, an update from someone named Diane R., thanking everyone for helping make her daughter's bridal shower. Such a success. And adding a thank you to Evan from the Ridgeview lot, for kindly letting us borrow his extra space for parking. Lifesaver. My jaw clenched so hard, I thought I might crack a molar. That post had 52 likes, 9 heart emojis, and comments ranging from, "He's always so generous," to, "We should give him a community award." Generous? I hadn't agreed to a damn thing. I didn't even know there was a bridal shower happening today. I marched down the street toward 108 Holloway, following the trail of pastel balloons tied to mailbox posts and the faint sound of acoustic music wafting from a rented speaker setup. Their driveway was filled with folding chairs, hanging flower garlands, and a table piled with cupcakes and glittery mason jars. I recognized most of the faces there. HOA board members, a couple of realtors, and the vice president of the HOA himself, Charles Greer, holding a mimosa in one hand and laughing with someone dressed like they'd walked off the set of a reality show. I approached Charles directly, holding up the sign in my hand like it was evidence in a courtroom. "You want to tell me who wrote this?" I asked. He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, hey, Evan," he said casually. "We just borrowed the lot for a few hours. You weren't using it." "That's not what I asked," I replied, voice level but sharp. "Who wrote this and said I gave permission?" Charles didn't even flinch. "Diane said it was fine. She said you were cool with it. It's not like it's permanent." I turned to Diane, who was arranging party favors by the punch bowl. "You forged a sign with my name on it," I said loud enough for half the crowd to hear. Diane's smile faltered, but only slightly. "Oh, come on, Evan, don't be dramatic. We all assumed you wouldn't mind. It's not like you do anything with that land anyway. Besides, it's for a bridal shower." "What? Are we really hurting?" I looked around, pointing at the muddy tire tracks in the distance. "You're destroying my property, you're trespassing, and you're lying." At that, the mood shifted. A few people stopped sipping their drinks. "Someone's kid dropped a cookie." Charles raised his hands as if to calm things down. Okay. Let's all take a breath. Nobody's trying to start a war here. It's just a misunderstanding. The board assumed you'd be willing, especially since you're not technically part of the HOA." "Exactly," I said. "I'm not part of the HOA. That means you don't get to use my land without asking. You certainly don't get to speak for me." "We'll clean it up afterward," Diane said, already turning back toward the table as if the conversation was over. "I'll even send one of the landscaping boys by Monday to rake it out. Problem solved." "You think that solves anything?" I asked, my voice rising now. "You all keep treating my land like it's an extension of your clubhouse." But Diane didn't respond. No one did. I was dismissed with a glance, waved off like an angry parent at a PTA meeting. I left before I said something I'd regret. Back at home, I photographed the cars, the sign, the tire ruts in the grass. I considered calling the police to report the trespassing, but I already knew how that would go. Civil matter, they'd say. Take it up with the HOA. When the cars finally cleared out that afternoon, I walked the field to assess the damage. Empty cans littered the grass. A paper plate was stuck in a bush, and someone had knocked over the small stone bird bath I'd installed near the trees. It was cracked clean through the base. I picked it up and carried it back to the porch, setting it beside the mangled sign. The next morning, a bright yellow envelope was stuck to my front door. I assumed it was an apology note, or maybe an offer to pay for the bird bath, but no, it was a citation. A $250 fine for unauthorized signage in public view. According to the citation, the overflow parking sign I'd pulled from the driveway violated Pinebrook Hollow's aesthetic guidelines and had not been approved by the HOA's Architectural Review Committee. I stood there, stunned. Not only had someone else written the sign and stuck it in my yard without permission, they had now filed an official complaint against me for it. I wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. Yet there it was, in bold black print, stamped and sealed. Violation issued, signage noncompliance, $250 due within 14 days. I looked around my porch, half expecting to see a hidden camera or some HOA prank crew ready to say I'd been punked. But no one was there. Just the envelope, clinging to my door like a sick joke. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't just laziness or ignorance. The HOA wasn't just turning a blind eye to trespassers. They were actively protecting them, backing them, even punishing me for resisting. I wasn't just fighting nosy neighbors now. I was up against a machine, and they just fired the first official shot. The quiet peace I'd protected for 5 years was gone. My land had become their staging ground, and I was done waiting for them to show me respect. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But this time, I wasn't just going to complain, I was going to dig. And what I was about to uncover would turn every smug little citation into the beginning of the end. After that $250 citation showed up on my door, something shifted. Whatever illusion I had left, that the HOA board was just misguided or confused, died right then. I wasn't dealing with neighbors anymore. I was dealing with entitled bureaucrats who saw my property not as private land, but as an asset they could exploit. And what came next only proved how far they were willing to go when someone didn't bow to their fake authority. It started slow, like a leaky faucet you can't quite hear until it floods the whole damn kitchen. 2 days after the bridal shower incident, there was a wine and welcome gathering hosted by the board for new residents. I found out about it the same way I found out about every other HOA event, by seeing a dozen cars nose deep in my meadow. The familiar cardboard sign was back, different handwriting but same fake message. Overflow parking permitted, Evan approved. Thank you. Only this time someone had taken the liberty of printing it on glossy paper and taping it to a traffic cone. I walked over, ripped it off, and tossed it into the trash, but the damage was done. I counted 24 cars spread across my field that evening, including one that had the audacity to park directly on top of the small wildflower bed I'd spent 2 seasons planting and maintaining. When I confronted one of the attendees, a woman in oversized sunglasses and heels that weren't built for grass, she just blinked at me and said, "Isn't this HOA property?" That statement didn't even make me angry. It made me cold. They'd already succeeded in spreading the lie that my land was common space, and now every guest they welcomed into their twisted little kingdom believed it. I put up signs, real ones this time, big, aluminum ones from the hardware store, bolted to wooden stakes. Private property, no parking, trespassers will be towed. I installed 4 of them across the perimeter, spaced just wide enough that nobody could claim they didn't see them. I even laminated small copies and stuck them in my windows. And for one brief moment, I felt a strange flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be enough to get the message across. That hope lasted exactly one night. By morning, all 4 signs were gone. Not knocked over, not damaged. Gone. Bolts unscrewed. Stakes pulled from the ground like they'd been yanked with purpose. Whoever did it didn't want to vandalize my property. They wanted to erase the evidence that I had even tried to protect it. And they didn't stop there. A few days later, I installed a chain across the gravel split-off that led into the field. It wasn't heavy duty, just a simple warning barrier with a small padlock and a second, friendlier sign that said, "Please do not enter. Private drive." I thought maybe the softer tone would get the point across. I was wrong. The next morning, the chain was lying neatly coiled on the ground beside the post, padlock intact, but completely unhooked. It wasn't cut or broken. It had been deliberately unlocked, unlatched, and left there like a taunt. No cars that day, just the quiet reminder that I wasn't in control anymore. And then the citations began. At first, I assumed the HOA couldn't legally issue me violations since I wasn't under their jurisdiction. But apparently, they didn't care about legalities when they had clipboards and laminated lanyards. A bright pink notice appeared on my door midweek. Citation: Land misuse, unauthorized terrain obstruction, barrier chain, in communal visual corridor. The wording was so absurd, I actually laughed out loud. A visual corridor? What the hell did that even mean? I didn't even have sidewalks. I lived off a dirt road. But they weren't done. The next week, it was a warning for excessive native vegetation on the edges of my meadow. A few days later, another, for non-compliant exterior tone inconsistency. which apparently referred to my house not matching the HOA's recommended palette of warm beiges. That one nearly made me punch a wall. My home was built in 1997, before the HOA even existed, and had been painted the same weathered gray for over 2 decades. Still, the notices kept coming, and every single one came with a fine attached. $150 here, $200 there. It added up. I called the county. They told me I wasn't liable for any of it, but until I filed formal legal opposition, they couldn't do much to stop the HOA from delivering these citations to my property. They have no enforcement power, the clerk told me. But they know that. They're trying to pressure you. No kidding, it wasn't just citations. The neighbors joined in, like flies to garbage once they smelled blood. One day, Buck, my golden retriever, was lying on the front grass, leashed as always, sunbathing in his usual spot near the porch. I was working on the siding when a black Jeep pulled into my field without slowing down, spun slightly to the left, and backed up quickly, too fast, and clipped Buck's side with its bumper. He yelped. I dropped my tool belt and sprinted down the slope. By the time I got to the car, the teenage driver was halfway out of the vehicle, staring at me like I was the problem. He came out of nowhere, the boy mumbled. You were in my field, I snapped. That's private property, and there's a dog sign at the top of the driveway. My mom said it's fine to park here, he muttered. She said this is like overflow. I almost lost it. Buck limped back up the hill, tail between his legs. He'd be okay, just bruised, but I wasn't. I took photos of the car, of the kid's plate, of Buck's wound. I called animal control. I filed a report. I even emailed the HOA board that night, copying the county sheriff, with a request for them to provide the name of the parent who told her kid it was okay to use my field. I didn't get a reply. But I did get another citation 3 days later. Improper animal handling, animal not secured during community event, Pinebrook Kids Carnival. That event wasn't even on my street. That was the moment I knew, absolutely knew, that someone on the board had made it personal. And the final straw, the sprinkler system. I had an old but reliable irrigation setup I'd installed when I first moved in. Underground PVC lines with a series of pop-up heads spaced throughout the field. I rarely used them, mostly just to keep the wildflowers and low grass alive during dry weeks. One Monday morning, I flipped the system on just to give it a 15-minute cycle. Nothing happened. I checked the timer, the valve, everything. Still dead. Confused, I popped open the main distribution box by the utility shed. That's when I saw it. The manifold had been tampered with. The PVC pipe was cracked in 3 places, clean cracks, not pressure bursts. And one of the sprinkler heads had been pulled from the ground, torn completely from the line, and tossed into the bushes. There was no animal that could have done that. It was deliberate. Someone had sabotaged my system. No note, no explanation. Just silence and a dead sprinkler line that would cost hundreds to fix. That night, I sat on the porch, Buck's head on my lap, staring out at the empty field and the chaos it had become. My peace was gone, my signs were gone, my chain was gone. My property rights were mocked. My dog was limping. And now, my irrigation system, one of the few things I could control, was destroyed. They had taken everything but my will to fight. And that, I realized, was their mistake. Because while they played dirty with forged signs and fake citations, I'd been gathering evidence. I had photos, footage, a log of every violation notice, a file full of printouts, and most importantly, I had one advantage they didn't expect. I had been quiet. They assumed silence meant surrender. But what they didn't know was that I was documenting every move, building a case, and preparing to hit them where it hurt the most. Not with shouting, not with protests, but with paperwork, with statutes, with law. I wasn't going to post angry rants online or scream at board meetings. I was going to weaponize the very thing they pretended to understand, regulations. And by the time I was done, they would wish they had just left me, and my land, the hell alone. The very night they destroyed my irrigation system, I stayed up until 3 a.m., not pacing, not ranting, but researching. If they wanted to play legal games, I was going to beat them at their own boardroom. I started by digging through my original purchase paperwork from 5 years ago. My property had always been in a weird zone, technically part of the original Ridgeview Acres development, which was dissolved before Pinebrook Hollow came into being. When I first bought the place, I remembered my realtor mentioning that I was outside HOA enforcement, but that had always been a throwaway line, something I took for granted and never thought to verify. Now, I pulled out my plat maps, my deed, and my parcel boundaries, and compared them to Pinebrook Hollow's current HOA jurisdictional map, which, luckily for me, was public record. And there it was, plain as day. My land, parcel 487B, was never annexed. In fact, Pinebrook's jurisdiction stopped almost 30 feet from my southern boundary line. Their own HOA incorporation documents, which I found in the county archive website, clearly listed only parcels 488 through 517. I wasn't just technically outside their control. I was legally immune to anything they tried to enforce. Every citation, every warning, every phony complaint they'd slapped on my door was toothless, worthless, enforceable only if I willingly submitted to their imaginary authority, which I hadn't. I stared at that zoning map with a smile that hadn't touched my face in weeks. They'd built their empire on assumptions and arrogance, and I now held the match to burn it all down. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted more than immunity. I wanted leverage, so I went further. I started reading through Pinebrook Hollow's HOA bylaws, page after page of digital sludge that no one in their right mind would willingly sift through. But buried deep in Section 6.7, under the title Abandoned or Improperly Stored Vehicles, I found something that made me sit upright and reread it twice. The clause was specific. Any vehicle parked on private property for more than 72 consecutive hours without the explicit, documented consent of the property owner may be deemed abandoned and subject to removal at the property owner's discretion after reasonable notice has been posted. I didn't need HOA permission to remove cars from my land. In fact, according to their own bylaws, which they were so fond of weaponizing, I had the right to remove them myself as long as I followed the rulebook. And even better, my local county ordinance reinforced the same standard. 72 hours of unapproved parking on private property constituted abandonment, and the landowner had the legal right to initiate towing and even liquidation procedures with proper documentation. I rubbed my eyes and grinned at the screen. This wasn't just a loophole, it was a golden ticket. I wasn't going to file another complaint or send another ignored email. No, I was going to take action the moment they crossed the line again. So I started preparing my trap. Quietly, methodically. I began by photographing the property, not just one or two angles, but a full 360-degree sweep of my entire front field and driveway. I took time-stamped videos at dawn and dusk to prove the area was empty. I installed a pair of trail cams, cheap ones, but good enough to catch license plates and timestamps. I printed out 3 dozen laminated notices and slipped them into weather-resistant plastic sleeves. Each one read, "Notice, this is private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be considered abandoned after 72 hours. Removal and disposal procedures will begin immediately after that period." I staked them evenly around the field, zip-tied one to the mailbox, and stuck another on the side of my shed. Then, I did something that would take the entire plan to the next level. I filed a request with the county clerk for a temporary private auction permit. It was a rarely used clause for rural residents dealing with abandoned property. Most people didn't even know it existed. But according to the ordinance, if a vehicle remained on private property beyond 72 hours, and if the owner failed to respond to written notice, the property owner could host a public auction for the purpose of recovering damages or fees related to unauthorized use. All I had to do was document the infraction and provide proof that I'd posted public notice. I submitted my application online and got confirmation the next day. I even paid the $45 fee for expedited processing. With that done, I reached out to a towing company 2 towns over, one that specialized in rural repossessions and didn't flinch at HOA politics. I told them my situation. The owner, Rick, chuckled when I explained. They've been pulling that crap in this county for years. People don't realize you've got more rights than they do. We'll be ready. Just call us when the deadline hits. I added him to my phone as Rick Towing backup plan. The last thing I did was prepare a folder, printed, laminated, and sealed, of every piece of documentation I might need. My property deed, zoning maps, photos of empty land, screenshots of HOA bylaws, county ordinances, and a copy of the auction permit. I stuck it in my truck's glove box and kept a backup at home. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. All I needed now was for them to overstep again, and they didn't disappoint. The following weekend was Pinebrook's Spring Bash, an annual HOA event complete with food trucks, bounce castles, and local vendors that turned their main cul-de-sac into a mini fairground. I already knew what was coming, so I mowed the field, made sure my signs were clearly visible, and waited. And sure enough, by 11 a.m. Saturday, the cars began to roll in. 1, 2, 7, 12, 20. By noon, my field was filled with 29 cars and 2 small catering vans. And just like that, the trap was sprung. I didn't say a word. I didn't storm into the party. I didn't yell. I simply documented every vehicle, every plate, every angle. I updated my logbook with timestamps and printed copies of each photo. Then I walked through the field calmly and placed a laminated notice on every windshield. This vehicle is parked on private property without permission. If not removed within 72 hours, it will be considered abandoned and subject to removal and sale under County Ordinance 14-8A. I signed each one with my full name, address, and the official auction permit number. Some people saw me doing it. They laughed. I heard someone mutter, "Evan's having a meltdown again," as if I was the crazy one for enforcing my own property rights. One teenage girl took a selfie next to my sign and tagged it number Karen Energy. I didn't care. Let them mock me. Let them feel invincible for one last weekend. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I wasn't bluffing. On Monday morning, I filed a notice of intent to tow with the county's abandoned vehicle division. I submitted my photos, my 72-hour warnings, and my property documents. They approved the process within 3 hours. The clock was ticking. I called Rick. "You might want to have your guys ready by Thursday afternoon," I said. "Looks like we've got ourselves an auction coming up." Rick chuckled. "We'll bring the flatbeds." For the next 3 days, I sat back and watched as the vehicles remained right where they were. A few disappeared. Probably the ones whose owners had actually read the notice. But by Wednesday afternoon, there were still 7 cars left, parked exactly where they'd been the day of the event. No calls, no apologies, not even a note, just silence. They thought I wouldn't dare. They thought I was bluffing. They thought, like always, that I would roll over and let them treat my land like their convenience. But they were wrong. They had crossed the line for the last time. The documents were filed. The signs were posted. The 72-hour clock had expired. My land was ready, and so was I. The next time they looked out their windows, they'd see fences, cameras, a podium, and an auctioneer. And then, for the first time in their privileged lives, they'd understand that actions have consequences. The fundraiser was announced on a Wednesday, one of those overly cheerful HOA-wide emails full of stock clip art and exclamation points, inviting all residents and their guests to the Spring Bloom Soiree, hosted by none other than HOA President Diane Latham at her sprawling, white-columned monstrosity of a house on the lot adjacent to mine. A charitable event, it said, to benefit local parks with wine tastings, live jazz, and a silent auction. I didn't give it much thought at first. These events were common in Pinebrook Hollow. Ridiculous, overplanned social circuses where the board could pat themselves on the back while pretending they were making the world a better place, one overpriced raffle ticket at a time. But by Friday afternoon, I knew this one would be different. I knew this was going to be their mistake, the one they couldn't walk away from. because by 4 p.m., cars were already crawling up my gravel driveway like ants swarming sugar. They weren't just parking on the edge of the field anymore. They were driving in rows. Neat, organized rows. Someone had even marked spots with tiny orange flags. 23 cars and 2 oversized catering vans were situated across my field like it was a makeshift concert venue. I saw a woman in a flowing blue dress guiding vehicles with a fluorescent wand, laughing like this was the most normal thing in the world. No one knocked. No one called. No one even looked in my direction. They were so comfortable trespassing that they didn't bother to pretend it was anything else. And that's when I saw her. Diane herself. She stood on her porch with a glass of wine, wearing a peach shawl and those enormous bug-eyed sunglasses that made her look like a praying mantis. She sipped delicately as I walked toward her across the lawn with my camera already rolling. "Diane," I said evenly, raising the camera so she could see the red recording light. "You and I need to talk right now." She lowered her glass slowly and sighed, like I was a toddler interrupting her grown-up party. "Evan, not this again. It's just one evening. It's for charity." "On my land," I said. "Without my permission, again." "Oh, come on," she said with a laugh, waving a hand in the air like she was shooing away a fly. "You're not even using it. It's just grass. What's the big deal?" I held up one of the laminated 72-hour notices I had printed in advance. "You see this? This is legally binding. Every car here will have one of these on their windshield in the next 15 minutes. You've got 72 hours, Diane. And after that, they're gone. I'm done playing nice." She smirked. Smirked! "Oh, Evan," she said. "You really need to learn to let things go. It's a community. We share things. Not when that sharing comes at my expense," I replied. "You've made your point," she snapped, clearly annoyed now. "Enjoy your tantrum. You're only making yourself look bad." I didn't say another word. I walked back to my property, documented every car with time-stamped photos, and slid one of my laminated notices under every single wiper blade. Each one included the auction date, time, and location. My location, my property, my rules. The clock started then. 72 hours. I printed an updated notice with bold red text and mounted it on a wooden board at the edge of my driveway. Public notice. Unauthorized vehicles on private property will be subject to removal and auction after 72 hours per county ordinance. I listed the date. I listed the time. I listed the statute. I listed the permit number. Legally, morally, logistically, I was covered. I even posted the same information in the Pinebrook Hollow Facebook group, which triggered a predictable wave of sarcasm, emojis, and condescending responses. "Sounds like someone needs a hug," wrote one board member. "Evan's off his meds again," said another. But I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because every smug post, every fake laugh, every eye roll on that thread only confirmed how safe they felt, how untouchable, and they had no idea how hard they were about to fall. By the end of the 72-hour window, only 7 vehicles remained. The others had quietly disappeared over the weekend, no doubt after a few panicked messages spread through the grapevine. But these 7 SUVs, a Tesla, a Mercedes coupe, a lifted truck, and 2 compact sedans, sat abandoned on my land like trophies. Not a single owner had contacted me. Not one had knocked on my door or sent an apology. The Monday morning of the auction, I called Rick from the towing company. "Still good to go?" I asked. "Trucks are already gassed and waiting," he said. "We'll be there by noon." At exactly 11:45 a.m., 2 flatbeds and a rollback truck rumbled down my driveway, engines purring like wolves in the grass. Rick hopped out with a clipboard and a coffee, gave Buck a pat on the head, and nodded toward the lineup of vehicles. "You weren't kidding," he said. "Nice selection here. Think the Mercedes will go fast." "Fastest it's moved all week," I replied. We got to work. The vehicles were loaded carefully, each one photographed from multiple angles, logged into a spreadsheet, and placed behind a temporary fence I had set up at the back of the field, right next to the wooden auction sign I'd staked into the ground. I even strung up pennant flags between poles to make it look festive. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. By 2 p.m., curious neighbors were slowing their cars as they passed. A few stopped to ask what was going on. I handed them flyers. Abandoned vehicle auction, Tuesday at 6 p.m. sharp. Open to the public. All vehicles sold as is, no reserve. Word spread like wildfire. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange behind the pines, nearly 40 people gathered around the edge of my property. Some brought lawn chairs. A few had cameras. One guy even brought popcorn. Rick set up a small PA system, and I stood at a folding table with my documentation in hand. Clipboard, auction license, proof of notices, photographs, everything. At 5:45 p.m., Diane arrived. She stormed across the lawn in a sharp blazer and heels that sank into the grass with every furious step. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You're making a scene." "The only scene," I said calmly, "is the one you created when you decided my land was yours to exploit. You don't have the right." "I do have the right," I said, cutting her off. "Per Pinebrook Hollow's own bylaws and County Statute 14-8A, your cars are abandoned. They were properly notified. And this," I gestured to the flags, the signs, the crowd, "is a legal auction permitted and authorized. You're going to regret this," she whispered. "You think you've won, but this is war." "No," I said, "this is consequence." At exactly 6 p.m., Rick stepped up to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "welcome to Pinebrook's first and probably only private auction. Let's start with the 2020 Tesla Model 3. Opening bid, $7,000. A hand shot up. "8," another voice called. Diane let out a strangled gasp. "That's my car." "Not anymore," Rick said without missing a beat. "Ma'am, you had 72 hours to move it. It's now subject to auction law. Please step back." The bidding went fast. The Mercedes sold for $10,500. The Tesla went for $13,000. The two sedans were snatched up by a pair of eager college students. Every time that gavel hit the table, I felt a piece of my sanity restored. Not out of spite, not even revenge, just the sheer satisfaction of knowing the rules had worked for me this time. That the quiet man on the edge of the neighborhood, the one they'd laughed at, mocked, and dismissed, had turned their own playbook against them and won. By 7 p.m., the field was empty. The buyers had arranged transport. The crowd dispersed, buzzing with disbelief and gossip. Diane had vanished the moment her Mercedes was sold, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and panic. I walked the field one last time, Buck trotting beside me, the air cool and clean now that the chaos had cleared. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Like the foundation under my feet had finally stopped shifting. I had protected my land, legally, publicly, irrefutably. They couldn't spin this. They couldn't find me. They couldn't pretend it didn't happen. The fatal mistake wasn't that they parked on my property. It was that they assumed I'd never fight back. They underestimated me. They underestimated the law. And now, the whole neighborhood would know just how dangerous that kind of arrogance could be. The fallout began even before the auction had ended. The moment the first vehicle was loaded onto the flatbed and that auctioneer's gavel cracked through the air, it was like someone had set off a bomb in Pinebrook Hollow, but instead of fire and smoke, it was panic, denial, and finger-pointing. By the time the fourth car rolled off the lot, the HOA board was in full damage control mode. Board member Marvin Briggs was the first to show up, sweat already staining the armpits of his button-down shirt as he jogged awkwardly down my gravel driveway, red-faced and wheezing. "You can't do this, Evan!" he shouted, gesturing at the crowd and the auction signs like they were illegal contraband. "This is OA business! These are our members' vehicles!" "Wrong," I replied calmly, motioning to the folder I'd kept tucked under my arm all week. "These are abandoned vehicles, on private property, and they're being removed in accordance with both county law and your own bylaws. You know those things you only enforce when it benefits you." He blinked at me, stunned. "This is a legal nightmare. You're gonna get sued." "Maybe," I said with a shrug. But I won't be the one losing. Just as he opened his mouth to argue, two more board members arrived. Corinth, the secretary, and Russell, the treasurer. Both were on their phones, speaking in panicked tones while trying to figure out what legal lever they could pull to shut me down. They weren't subtle. I caught snippets like emergency injunction and asset recovery and can we call the sheriff. I smiled at that last one. You don't have to, I said loudly enough for them to hear. He's already on his way. Right on cue, a black and white cruiser pulled into the driveway, tires crunching softly against gravel as Sheriff Will Grady stepped out. A big man with the kind of presence that silences entire rooms without speaking, he adjusted his belt, looked around at the field, the signs, the crowd, the cars lined up for bidding, and then turned to me. Evan, he said, tipping his hat, you got everything ready for me? All right here, Sheriff, I said, handing him the folder. Inside were copies of my deed, the auction permit, photos of each car with the 72-hour notices in place, time-stamped footage from my trail cams, and printed copies of the relevant HOA bylaw that allowed for removal of unauthorized vehicles plus the corresponding county statute. He took his time flipping through it. Meanwhile, the board members stood off to the side, whispering to each other like school kids caught cheating on a test. Sheriff Grady finally snapped the folder shut. Everything looks in order, he said. You posted notices, gave more than sufficient time, documented each step, and this property, he pointed a thick finger at the ground, ain't under HOA jurisdiction, which means they don't get to decide what happens on it. The color drained from Karen's face. Russell looked like he was going to be sick. Marvin muttered something under his breath and started walking backward toward the road, like he could disappear into the hedges. So, unless anyone wants to press false trespassing charges, the sheriff continued, I suggest you let the man run his auction in peace. From that point on, the rest of the auction went smoother than I ever expected. The Tesla fetched over 13 grand. The Mercedes coupe went for 10. Even the rust-speckled SUV pulled in 5,000 from a buyer who knew a guy who could fix it up. But the real prize wasn't the money. It was the message. Every car sold came with a quiet gasp, a shared glance, a whisper across the lawn. The neighbors, many of whom had sat on their porches or ignored my complaints for years, were now witnessing the reckoning. And as the hammer came down on the last vehicle, the mood shifted entirely. I wasn't the cranky loner with too much land anymore. I was the guy who made the board look weak. And suddenly, people wanted to talk. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. Videos of the auction popped up on local Facebook groups, then on Reddit, then TikTok. One clip titled, HOA Karen Gets Schooled at Her Own Game, hit 200,000 views in 3 days. A news crew from the county station showed up for a segment called Know Your Property Rights. By the end of the week, I was fielding emails from other HOA-burdened residents asking how I'd done it. But behind the social media storm, something much more serious was unfolding. The auction had triggered scrutiny not just from curious residents, but from the county itself. I wasn't the only one with questions. People started digging. A few residents, spurred on by the auction's publicity, requested a full audit of Pine Brook Hollow's finances, and what they found was pure gasoline on a fire. Thousands of dollars in unaccounted landscaping charges, emergency fees billed to homeowners for services that were never performed, vendor contracts awarded to relatives of board members. It was a smorgasbord of petty corruption hiding beneath the guise of community order. I watched it all unfold quietly, a front-row seat to the implosion I'd been waiting for. Within 2 weeks, Dianeth, the HOA president who once told me to get over it, was being investigated by the county's ethics board. She resigned via email, citing harassment from hostile elements in the neighborhood. Marvin followed, then Karen, then Russell. 4 out of 7 board members gone within 3 weeks. The remaining 3 tried to hold things together, but they were in over their heads. They called an emergency meeting to address restructuring. That's when the residents made their move. The petition to dissolve the current board had hit the threshold, and at the meeting held in the same community hall, where I'd once been brushed aside like an afterthought, the neighbors voted unanimously to form a temporary interim board, while a proper election could be held. I wasn't going to run at first. I'd never wanted to be part of the HOA. But several people came up to me after the meeting and begged me to get involved. "We need someone who actually knows the law," one man said. "Someone who won't let the power go to their head." So I agreed, not for power, not for revenge, but because I knew the playbook now. I knew how they operated, how they used language, perception, and silence as weapons. If I could keep that from ever happening again to me or anyone else, it'd be worth it. The next election, I was voted in as HOA treasurer with an overwhelming majority. The first thing I did was introduce a motion to cap board authority regarding non-HOA parcels. Then, we passed a bylaw that prohibited any future events from using land not explicitly zoned under the HOA no exceptions. And after 6 months of restructuring, audits, and cleanup, we voted on the big one, to dissolve the Pinebrook Hollow HOA entirely. And we did. A full 82% of homeowners voted in favor. By the end of the year, Pinebrook was no longer an HOA community. It was just a neighborhood. Peaceful, cooperative, normal, the way it should have been all along. As for me, I finally reseeded the meadow, fixed the irrigation lines, and rebuilt my little bird bath with a new stone I found on a trip out west. Buck's limp faded over time, and now he runs through the field again without fear. On quiet evenings, I sit on the porch and sip coffee while he chases squirrels near the old fence line. Sometimes a neighbor will wave as they walk by. Sometimes they'll stop to talk. No more entitled attitudes. No more forged signs. No more threats dressed up as HOA letters. Just people. Living next to each other. Respecting boundaries. And if someone ever forgets what happened, I'll be there to remind them, not with words, but with a laminated notice, a deed, a folder of receipts. Because while they thought the law was a tool they could bend, I proved it's a blade. And sometimes it cuts both ways.